So institutional aggression. So this is aggression within the prison setting that we're going to be focusing on, and you need to be aware of situational explanations. So that's the deprivation model, and dispositional explanations. So that's the importation model. So situational explanations are going to say that it is the prison environment itself that is going to be causing that aggressive behaviour. Now, the theory that we're going to look at is deprivation. Now, that states that it is the deprivation that is experienced by the inmates that leads them to be aggressive. So, such deprivations affects the prisoner's ability to maintain and form healthy relationships with people outside the prison. And it is the prison itself that causes aggression. Now, Sykes believes that there were 5 main deprivations that cause the inmates to be aggressive. Now, you have deprivation of liberty. So the person has lost their civil rights. Deprivation of goods and services. So the inmates are deprived of things that they could obtain if they were free. So the fact that they could go and buy food, they could go and engage in other services such as entertainment facilities, that they can no longer do. You have deprivation of heterosexual relationships, so it refers to the lack of female companionship in the prison itself. Deprivation of autonomy, so the inmates realise that they cannot make the basic choices for themselves, so they can't decide when they go to bed, because lights out will go at a certain time. When they leave their cells, they might not be able to decide when meal time is. They might not decide when they might be able to go and use the gym or go outside into the outside areas such as the courtyard. They might not be able to decide when they watch TV, etc. And then they also have deprivation of security, so that refers to any potential threats and personal safety that might exist from the inmates within the prison. So the idea is that it is the prison environment and those 5 deprivations that leads the inmate to act in a way that is aggressive and violent, because they can't have that healthy relationship. Now, importation model is a dispositional explanation. So dispositional is the idea that it's within the person itself. It's not to do with the prison, it's the inmates themselves that cause the institutional aggression. Now, that suggests that prisoners bring in their own social histories and traits with them. And that leads to the subsequent aggressive behaviour. So men bring with them that ready-made way of behaving, and they simply apply it to their new institutional setting. So they just apply it to the prison setting. Now, Irwin and Cressy claim that the inmates who enter the prison with certain personality traits are more likely to engage in interpersonal conflict with others. So the aggression that is in prison is not specific to that institution. So it's likely that they were aggressive on the outside, and it is that aggressive behaviour that has led them to be in the prison in the first place. So it states that younger inmates find it more difficult to adjust to the prison and therefore are more likely to have confrontation, and they are also more likely to view aggression as more appropriate response to conflict. So it's likely that they had engaged in gang criminal behaviour and violent behaviour in the outside setting, and they apply that behaviour, that gang mentality, to the prison setting. So they are importing that way of behaving. So outline research into situational aggression. Now remember for AQA that research doesn't always mean a research study. You could talk about explanations and theories, so it's perfectly acceptable for you to talk about the deprivation model and the importation model within this. Now it's 4 marks, so you can either do one explanation in more detail, or you can do both in less detail. So it's that breadth and depth trade-off. So if you were to talk about one, obviously you'd have to mention 4 key facts, 4 key points about that model. If you were to do both of them, then only 2 key facts about each one. So moving on to evaluation then. So there is supporting evidence for the importation model. So it was found that regardless of citizenship, Hispanics were more violent than non-Hispanics. So that suggests that those cultural and social norms were carried through, were imported into the prison environment. So they had their own way of behaving and they used it in the prison environment. So that supports the model. We have contradictory evidence that deprivation links to violent behaviour. So McCorkle found that there was no relationship between overcrowding, lack of privacy, or lack of meaningful activity and peer violence within prisons. And that sample looked at 371 state prisons in the USA, and it's one of the largest studies in this area. So that fails to support the assumption that it's the prison environment itself that causes the institutional aggression. So it goes against the idea of that deprivation model, that situational factor. Equally, we have contradictory evidence for the importation model. So a study of over 800 male inmates found no evidence relationship between previous gang membership and misconduct within the prison. So that implies that prison violence was not caused by traits of the prisoners, but by other factors. So that reduces the assumptions that the prisoners bring in with them and import those ready-made ways of behaving into the prison environment. However, it is very useful, so it could lead to really important real-world application. So it's found that most violence happens in environments that are hot and noisy, and Wilson found that by changing such deprived environments, reduced the violent conduct among prison inmates in HMP Woodall. So that supports the usefulness of this theory that the deprivation model might mean that prison environments could be changed and reduce any prisoner violence, which in the long run could help with the economy. So they're not having to treat prisoners for wounds and injuries, etc. And it means that it's a better environment for the prison wardens to work in. So you reduce it, making that positive impact to the economy as well. So in terms of evaluation style questions, briefly explain one limitation of situational explanations of institutional aggression. Now this is quite a specific question. So it's saying that you need to have a limitation, so a weakness of the institutional aggression, and it needs to be a weakness of the situational explanation. So with this one, I would go down the route of that contradictory evidence that overcrowding, lack of meaningful activity, lack of privacy led to violent behaviour. So there was no relationship between the two. So that would be McCorkle's evidence. Equally, you have a 16 marker to discuss explanations of institutional aggression. So 16 marks, I would do my AO1 of situational explanation, deprivation, and talk about Sykes 5 deprivations and how that is the prison environment itself that is causing the aggressive behaviour. I would then have my 2 evaluation points, so the idea that there's contradictory evidence by McCorkle that found that there was no evidence that overcrowding led to violent behaviour, but equally that we have that strength, we have that real world application of the Woodall prison that found that actually changes to hot and noisy environments and overcrowding reduced violent conduct in inmates. I would then move on to my second explanation and do my AA1 of the importation model and say that it is traits of the prisoners themselves that leads to aggression, not the prison environment. So prisoners have brought in those traits, they have imported those ready-made ways of behaving and will respond in an aggressive way in the prison environment because they acted aggressively outside of the prison environment. I would then move on to my evaluation. So the fact that we have supporting evidence that it explains cultural differences, that Hispanics were more likely to engage in more violent crimes than non-Hispanics, that Asians were less likely than any other prisoners to engage in serious violent behaviours, which suggests that social histories do influence aggression, and that the prison environment isn't the factor, because you'd expect all ethnicities to behave the same, and they don't. So therefore it implies that it is down to the individuals themselves, not the prison environment. And then equally, you could talk about the contradictory evidence, that research found that there was no significant relationship between previous gang membership and misconduct within the prison, and that prison violence was not caused by the prisoners themselves.